This is the second video on the midpoint formula. We're going to look at some different types of problems in this video and complete that worksheet. We're going to complete 4, 5, and 6. Number 4, in this problem we're given the endpoint 2,5 and the midpoint 5,1. So we're going to take our formula, x1 plus x2 divided by 2, y1 plus y2 divided by 2, and we're going to plug in any information we know. So first of all, we know one of the endpoints. So this is 0.1. So we have x1 and we have y1. And we're just going to plug in this information. So x1 we know is 2. So x1 is 2. y1, I think it was 5. Yeah, y1 is 5. And the other piece of information that we know is that the midpoint is 5,1. Using this information, I can write an equation. 5 is supposed to be equal to 2 plus x sub 2 divided by 2. And then I just solve my equation. I multiply both sides by 2. On the right side I get 10. On the left side I'm left with 2 plus x sub 2. I subtract 2 from each side and we get x sub 2 equals 8. So I found the x value of the other endpoint. Now I can write my other equation. 5 plus y2 divided by 2 needs to equal 1. So 5 plus y2 divided by 2 needs to equal 1. I multiply both sides by 2. Then I subtract 5 from each side, and I get y2 is equal to negative 3. So now I have x2, I have y2. My other endpoint is 8, negative 3. Let me make sure that x value was an 8. Yep, so I have 8, negative 3. That is my other endpoint. So I solved to find my other endpoint. Let's go on to number 5. We have to do the same thing. We're given one endpoint, we're given the midpoint, we need to find the other endpoint. So I start with my equation, x1 plus x2 divided by 2, y1 plus y2 divided by 2. I label x1 and I plug it in. I label y1, because this is 0.1, and then I plug it in. 9 plus y2 divided by 2. Then I know that that midpoint is negative 9, negative 10. Well, I know that the result of taking negative 1 plus x sub 2 divided by 2 should give me negative 9, so I can set up my equation. Negative 1 plus x sub 2 divided by 2 needs to equal negative 9. I multiply both sides by 2, and I get negative 18 is equal to negative 1 plus x sub 2. 2 divided by 2 is equal to 1. And then I add 1 to both sides, and I get x sub 2 is equal to negative 17. So I have the x value of my other endpoint. Now I set up the second equation. 9 plus y2 divided by 2 is equal to negative 10. I multiply both sides by 2. I get negative 20 on the right. On the left, 2 divided by 2 is equal to 1. 1 times 9 plus y2 is just 9 plus y sub 2. I subtract 9 from each side and I get y sub 2 equals negative 29. So I have my other endpoint. I found x sub 2, y sub 2, x sub 2 was negative 17, and y sub 2 was negative 29, so my other endpoint was negative 17, negative 29. Now when you finish, if you have both the endpoints, if you want to check your work, use the midpoint formula to see if you come up with the original midpoint, and you'll know that you did it correct. Final problem. It goes back to what we were doing in 1 and 2 and 3. We have to start by finding the midpoint. So I'm going to label x1, x2. I add those together and divide by 2 to find the midpoint x value. Then I take y sub 1 and y sub 2, and I add them and divide by 2 to find the midpoint y value. Negative 4 plus 1 gives me negative 3, so negative 3 halves is my y value. 1 plus a negative 3 is a negative 2. Negative 2 divided by 2 is negative 1. So I have negative 1, negative 3 halves. That's my midpoint. Now, the next part asks you to find the line this time that is parallel to the original line and goes through the midpoint. Now, if it's parallel to the original line and goes through the midpoint, it's actually going to be the same line as the original. So what we're going to do is we're going to do what we normally do, and we're going to find the slope between the 2 points. So 1, negative 4, 1, negative 4, and negative 3, 1. And let me make sure I wrote down the right points. 1, negative 4, negative 3, 1. All right. From negative 4 to 1, we added 5. From 1 to negative 3, we decreased by 4. Slope is change in y over change in x. So it's negative 5 over positive 4. Or negative 4. I mixed those up. Positive 5 divided by negative 4. So the slope is a negative slope, negative 5/4. Now if we want something parallel to our original slope, we use the same slope. So we write y equals negative 5/4 x plus b. Well, we know it needs to go through the midpoint as well. So negative 1, negative 3 halves is going to be plugged in to y equals mx plus b. Instead of y, I plug in negative 3 halves. Negative 5/4 times negative 1 is just 5/4. I am going to subtract 5/4 from each side to get b alone using inverse operations. And b equals, well, negative 3 halves, negative 5/4. You have to make them have the same denominator. So we multiply that by 2 to get 4. We multiply that by 2 and we get negative 6. Negative 6 minus 5 gives us negative 11/4. So the equation is y equals negative 5/4 x minus 11/4. And if it's parallel to the original and goes through the midpoint, it would actually end up being the same line. But I want you to think about what you're doing with the slopes, because we need to review the difference between parallel and perpendicular lines as we get ready for the EOC.